Well, I said this would be a lecture, and so class is now begun. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about, go through the outline and talk to you and with you about same-sex attraction, identity, and marriage. And then we'll take some questions afterwards. There are some microphones, one here, one at the back, and another one at the back. So as I'm going through this, if there are questions that you're thinking about, write them down, and there'll be a time afterwards, and we can hopefully engage in some dialogue. So where do we begin? Where do we begin when we're talking about this topic that is very relevant for today and is one that is definitely on people's minds? Well, as you'll see there on the outline, where do we begin? I'd like to begin with civility. Everyone can think of someone with whom they disagree, who has been unloving or unkind, or who has decided that shouting the loudest is the way to win the argument. In other words, we all know somebody, no matter what position you may take on this particular issue, we all know someone who's been unkind, who's been unthoughtful, who hasn't been the most helpful conversation partner in this. And it's never helpful for us to begin by pointing out poor examples for people who disagree with us, regardless of what position they may take. Even in a pluralistic society, there are some universal truths, such as no one likes to be shouted at. People appreciate a good listener, and kindness matters. So to this end, no matter what you believe about same-sex attraction or the morality of same-sex marriage, I would urge you to give grace and to give space. To give grace and space. And to take them in reverse order. Space, what do I mean by giving someone space? What I mean is give someone time to speak. Give someone the space to tell you who they are. Get to know them. Get to understand who they are. Get to understand why they believe as they do, or why they think the way they do, or why they hold the opinions that they do. Don't cut them off with the bounty of your wisdom. I know the world is waiting with bated breath to hear all the wonderful things you have to say, but that world only exists in your mind. So just be quiet and listen. Give someone space. Also, have grace, space and grace. Grace, which is the same idea basically, but take time to listen. You know, just allowing someone time to speak is not necessarily the same thing as taking the time to listen. Don't wait for somebody, again, no matter which side or which aspect of this whole issue or any other issue you may be on or you may take. There's a difference between just giving someone time to speak so that when they're finished, you can say your bit. It's better to take time to listen and find out again who they are. Seek to understand where they're coming from, why they believe as they do. And this leads us to the second point under where do we begin, and that is patience. We are living in a rapidly changing society. It used to be that this rapid change was always attached with technology. You know, for example, over just 50 years, we went from not being able to fly to putting somebody on the moon. For those of you who are really, really old, you remember the time before Google. That's just about everybody in the room. You remember a time when pre-iPad. Yeah, that was 2010. It's only been 5 years later. I mean, so we used to always associate this rapid movement and rapid change and rapid development with technology. But now, the pace of change, it seems, is applying to morality. And so we're not only moving quickly in technology, we seem to be moving rather rapidly with respect to morality. It struck me when I was reading the Wall Street Journal some weeks ago, and it was just after the Supreme Court had made its decision. And as I read the Wall Street Journal, I turned the page, and there was this graphic up at the top. It caught my eye, and I looked at it, and what it was 3 maps of the United States, the continental United States of America. And in the first map, it said 2011, the number of states that had legalized same-sex unions or same-sex marriage, and I think there was 1. And then 2013, the number that had done that, and then you could only pick out just a few. And then because of the Supreme Court decision, 2015, the entire map was colored in that direction. And it caught for me, at least graphically speaking, in this image, how quickly morality had changed. And while relatively rapid shifts in popular morality have taken place, I myself think of 11th century England. I'm sure you do too. thinking back to King William Rufus and all that, but perhaps you don't. But there have been periods in history where there have been rapid shifts in popular morality, but it is rare that the law of the land should shift so quickly with it. So to some degree, we are experiencing something that is no different than what we've experienced in history before. Changes and shifts in morality and the society's view of it. In other respects, it's quite unprecedented insofar as the laws themselves are changing quickly as well. And the rapidity with which these changes are occurring is helped along by significant leaders and figures in society. So, for example, of course, the Supreme Court judges have had a part to play in this, obviously. So has President Obama, who was the one who supported gay marriage and rights and so forth openly and in several of his speeches. And then, of course, you have governors of various states. So there are multiple ways in which this change is being addressed. Now, in this period of rapidly shifting moral paradigms, patience is needed on both sides. And there are actually multiple sides. I say both, that's a bit simplistic, but patience is needed everywhere. For those who support the LGBTQIA movement, bear in mind, again, that this can be a little bit confusing and disorienting for those who don't support that same movement. Think about it. In the last number of years, it was known as the gay movement, and then gay and lesbian, and then gay and lesbian and bisexual, and it was that for a little while, and then we added to that transgender and queer, which is how you get the LGBTQ. Well, if you refer to LGBTQ, you're now passé, because we've added I and A to the end of it, and which is intersex and asexual. So we now have the LGBTQIA movement. So many, even on university campuses, they're now out of date if they have the LGBTQ still attached to what they're doing. So with all of this, it is interesting to note that even within that community, and I'm making some generalities here, but even within that community, not everyone in that community who's part of that has agreed that the Supreme Court decision was a good idea. There is a minority, and not a small minority, within the LGBTQIA community that argue that marriage is a heterosexual category and therefore by definition should not be included in, and instead of using all those letters, I'll just say the gay community. It should be kept separate. They should not, in other words, the argument within that community is we don't want marriage. And so I say this to communicate that patience is needed because things are changing so rapidly. The way that people are thinking about morality are changing quickly. So be patient. Don't assume someone who disagrees with, I'll just call it the gay agenda, is being difficult. They may just be confused. They may just not understand. If you support that agenda, if you support that movement, you support those ideas, and talking to someone who doesn't, they may simply be confused. They don't know, what are all these letters? I don't know what they stand for. I don't know what they mean. I'm not sure what's going on. So be patient. And for those who do not support the gay agenda, don't jump to conclusions. If a man or a woman tells you they are gay, don't assume that they cannot be a Christian. Don't assume that they simply chose to be gay. Again, exercise patience. Well, with that, I want to move to number 2, some helpful distinctions, or what I hope will be some helpful distinctions that I think, at least I've found to be helpful. And here, I am shamelessly stealing from a friend of mine. Graham Cole is the dean of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he's an ethicist. He's a friend of mine, and I told him I would be shamelessly stealing his 4 categories, and he said that was fine. I told him I would give him credit. He didn't ask for it, but nevertheless, I want to make sure you understand these are not my own. First of all, when thinking about same-sex attraction, there's curiosity. Young people have always been curious. People generally have been curious, but I'm just going to deal with the young for a moment here. Young people have always been curious, and curious about just about everything. And in centuries gone by, that curiosity was generally bounded by certain common values and expectations that were in society. But with Hollywood, the entertainment industry, and so forth, we now have a large and increasingly large role being played by them, pushing the boundaries of what is permissible, what is acceptable, and almost encouraging any kind of curiosity you want, a kind of free-for-all. And of course, more recently, the internet has provided all manner of ways of discovering how you can satiate your curiosity. If you want to know what something looks like, pick up a phone, pick up a tablet, laptop, desktop, whatever, you can see it. It is all out there. And so for people who are, young people especially, who are curious and are wondering about these things, it's very easy to satisfy, satiate, or deal with that curiosity. Now, it's important to note here that curiosity is not the same as identity. In other words, just because a teenager, for example, is curious about members of the same sex, that does not mean that they're gay. It means that they're curious. That curiosity may be, from a Christian perspective, a curiosity that does not need to be addressed and does not need to be satisfied, but it is still just a curiosity. I think here, from Scripture, we should remember that we are warned 3 times in the Song of Songs, for example, not to awaken love prematurely. There is a time in which to speak about sexuality, but it must be done carefully. Our society, however, sees things differently. And our society seems so eager to awaken love and push curiosity to an ever younger age in the name of education, in the name of individuality, or something else. It is unwise to introduce, it seems to me, something as mature as sexual awareness into the immature. So to parents, perhaps there are some here, so to parents who discover, or your children tell you, that they are curious about members of the same sex, I would say 2 things. I would say, first of all, don't jump to the conclusion. Again, take patience. Be careful to think about this. Don't jump to the conclusion, my child is gay. It may simply be curiosity in a world that is pushing them to be curious in that direction. And I would say to the larger society, we shouldn't tell a child who is looking, or a teenager, whoever it may be, who is curious about these things, equally, it's not wise and right for them to say, oh, this means that your child is gay, just because they have a curiosity. So curiosity, it seems to me, is a distinction we need to make. Somebody can be curious about members of the same sex without having an orientation, and I'll talk about orientation in a minute, without having an orientation for being attracted necessarily to members of the same sex. So that's curiosity, and it's curiosity. Second, attraction. And attraction is a slightly stronger response, or at least it can be. But even here, we must take care to be careful in our thinking. It is possible for someone to find a person of the same sex attractive simply because they are aesthetically pleasing. Such an attraction needn't be misunderstood or confused, again, than more than it is, especially in light of society and the way that we work today. Think about it. Today, what matters so very much is image. The image that you show to the world, the image you create about yourself, how you dress, that's part of your image. How you do your hair, that's part of your image. Where you eat at restaurant, all of these sorts of things are part of your image, and we build up these images. And of course, the same is true within high school. And again, I'll draw on the example of teenagers. There is, and especially amongst women, there is this very strong desire on the part of society to give women, young ladies, multiple images. And you want to be this, you want to be that. This is the way you should be. And imagine, if you will, that you are a young woman or you're a young man, you're being told this is the image, whatever that image is. And then you see an older person of the same sex who is that image. You could be very attracted to that image simply because that's the image of everything you've been told you're supposed to long for in the first place. So now you're attracted to something, not because you have an interest in the same sex necessarily, but because this is the embodiment of everything you've been told by society you need to be like. And so there is a certain attraction there, more along the lines of aesthetics. And so we must be careful to understand that an attraction can be evidence of same-sex attraction, of someone who genuinely has that orientation, But we also must understand that there is a distinction to be made, and it's possible to be attracted to someone of the same sex, to recognize that someone of the same sex is a good-looking person without having necessarily the orientation. In fact, I would argue on this point of image. Some people might say, well, yes, this is a problem we have in society. Society is very stuck on image, and it's bad, and we shouldn't be doing that with anyone. We shouldn't be pushing image. In a different sort of way, I want to agree, but I also want to disagree. I think there is nothing more important than image. But the image that I think there's nothing more important than is the image of God. And that's the thing, one of the things that we must bear in mind and remember is that we have all been created in the image of God. And what matters is how well that image is what we show, is shown to the world. It's not the image that we create for ourselves or society tells us we need to imitate that matters most. God created us to be like him, which means, amongst other things, being loving, kind, gentle, patient, on and on it goes. So at any rate, when someone finds the same sex attractive, that again does not necessarily indicate a same-sex orientation. It could, but it doesn't necessarily have to be our first assumption. So that's curiosity, that's attraction. Third is orientation. Now, while someone who experiences these first two categories, as I said, is not necessarily gay, I'll just use that term as shorthand, although they could be, the person described in this category, orientation, has a decided interest in members of the same sex. And this person has not, for the most part, that someone like this will not have manufactured an interest in the same sex. They, as you'll hear, for example, in one of the books I mentioned at the bottom there, Sam Allberry, in his book, Is God Anti-Gay? He begins his book by, he's a pastor in the United Kingdom. He begins his book by saying, from as long as I can remember, when I first became aware of sexual matters, I have only ever been interested in members of the same sex. I've only ever been interested in men. And it's important for us to recognize that sometimes people will assume, oh, that person simply chooses to be gay. Well, as one conversation that recently took place between a member of our congregation and a gentleman who identified as being gay, she admitted, she said, I always thought that you chose to be gay. And his response was, really? Why would I choose, and he was talking specifically about years before now, he said, why would I choose to be something that would bring upon myself all manner of looks and persecution and being ostracized? I didn't choose this. Even he admitted, he's a Christian. He said, I don't even want this. But that's the way I'm attracted to other people. So it's important for us when we think about orientation to understand something, and I'll come back to this again and again, and it's important for us to understand this from a Christian perspective, that it is possible for someone to have same-sex attraction and for them to be a Christian. Because we also need to distinguish between same-sex attraction and homosexual activity. And again, I'll come back to that in just a moment. So we have curiosity, we have attraction, we have orientation, then we have identity. Identity. And this is the category that is constantly endorsed through the media. A person in this category has decided that their identity is bound up in or with their sexuality. In other words, sexuality defines humanity. As a friend of mine has said, what this means is that sexuality has in essence replaced the soul. It is the very thing that gives animus and life to humanity. At least that's the way it's portrayed by some. Another individual has argued that making one's sexuality the defining nature of humanity is to replace the image of God with sexuality, as though that were the image that mattered most. Now, I would agree with both these ideas that sexuality can replace the soul in a certain philosophical sense and it can also replace the image of God, or at least the attempt is made. But I would add, for clarity's sake, that the move to define humanity by our sexuality is not, for the most part, theologically or spiritually motivated. Why? Because the moment you set this issue, in terms of what defines humanity, you have set the stage to cry foul of human rights. And this is precisely what we've seen. How often have you heard the argument made that there's a comparison between gay rights and human rights, specifically slavery, or gay rights and civil rights, 1960s USA? The flaw in this, among other things, is that sexual orientation does not define human identity. All humanity is created to be God's image bearers. And the question that remains is, will we bear that image redemptively or rebelliously? So it's important for us to understand these distinctions, as I say, these four distinctions as we approach the subject of same-sex attraction. It's not the simplistic way of looking at it and saying it's either somebody has same-sex attraction or they don't. We can have somebody who's curious, and that's all there is to it. They're just at a level of maturity that they don't understand what that means, and they're a bit confused perhaps, or they're pushing the boundaries. We can have someone who has attraction, but that attraction doesn't necessarily need to be of a sexual nature. And of course, our world wants to do this all the time, don't we? We do this always. It's very difficult, it seems sometimes, to have a relationship with someone else and it not have, at least some people will say, not have a kind of sexual overtone to it. It's amazing, people will read, there was a famous medieval scholar, you knew that was coming at some stage. Very well-known medieval scholar out of Yale, if memory serves, John Boswell, who made the argument that, in fact, homosexuality, he himself identified himself as gay, that we have seen homosexuality in today's world is nothing new and nothing different. It's been far more pervasive than you could ever imagine. It's been everywhere. And he went through history and he tried to identify all kinds of characteristics of people throughout history. And he said, oh, see there, that person's gay, and that person is gay. And a number of the people that he drew out of the Middle Ages, he drew on them because of the letters that we have left to us between two men. And the way that these two men would write letters to one another, it would sound like, wow, this is an intense and intimate friendship. And the assumption was that you cannot have an intense and intimate friendship between two members of the same sex without it having a sexual component. And the problem is that for so much of human history, the problem with that argument is that for so much of human history, that's been one of the wonders of friendship, is that you can have a close and intimate relationship with another member of the same sex, and it has nothing to do with sexuality. We live in a very over-sexed culture, where everything, it seems, has to have that connotation, and it just isn't so. Number 3, so why are these distinctions helpful? Well, they may not be helpful to you, I don't know. But they're helpful to me. And since I'm the one talking, they get to be helpful to everyone. At least until Q&A, and then I discover the opposite. Why might I think these are helpful? First of all, it keeps us from running to conclusions, or rushing to conclusions. Christians shouldn't assume that someone with same-sex attraction is automatically not a Christian. I said that before, I'll say it again. Christians should not assume that someone with same-sex attraction is automatically not a Christian. They may have simply curiosity. They may have a certain degree of attraction of some kind. They may have an orientation. But that does not mean that they are necessarily, and I'll get to this again, I'll flesh this out a bit in Romans 1. But it's entirely possible for someone to choose not to act on their interests. And here's where we sometimes can make a double standard. Sometimes we can think, well, okay, let's take person A and person B. Person A thinks, well, I find myself very much attracted, I'll pick on me. So I find myself very much attracted to another woman who is not my wife. And the question becomes, well, all right, if I'm attracted to this other woman who is not my wife, is this something I fantasize about? Is this something I act on and commit adultery? Well, within Christian doctrine, within the Bible, both of those things are sin. I can see somebody who might be attractive and then just move on with my life, not think about it again. But if I dwell on it, if it's something that locks in my mind and I begin to do things in my mind and entertain certain fantasies, or I actually go and act on it, I have sinned. It is no different when another man looks at, say, someone else who is a man, and he finds that man attractive. If he just looks at that man and thinks, that's an attractive man, and moves on with his life, he's not sinned. He's identified someone as attractive, and he's moved on with his life, and it's dropped out of his head. He has that attraction, but he has chosen not to act on it. Similarly, however, if that man begins to fantasize about this other man, and if he begins to indeed engage in some sort of inappropriate behavior with him, then indeed that too is sin. So the homosexual and the heterosexual response, it's what we do with the attraction that we have. And it's vital for us to understand these two things. Similarly, just as Christians shouldn't assume that someone with same-sex attraction, and I choose my words carefully, by the way, I do distinguish, and just to reiterate, I do distinguish between same-sex attraction and homosexual behavior. They are two different things. But those in the gay community should not assume that curiosity or attraction constitute sufficient grounds for declaring someone gay. If someone is curious, you can't just run on that and say, aha, you must be gay. No, it could just be curiosity. So indeed, both sides must stop from rushing to conclusions and saying things that are out of step. Second, B, in 3B, and I've already talked about this a bit, these distinctions are helpful because they distinguish between, as I said, same-sex attraction and homosexual behavior or activity. And again, just to be clear here, it is vital to understand that finding someone attractive, whether of the same sex or different, is not a sin. You can find someone attractive. You can look at someone, and as a, I don't know if I can call him a friend or not, but as a former boss, I'll put it that way, would say there's nothing wrong with somebody walking down the street, and he was talking in the sense of a man and a woman. He said there's nothing wrong with a man walking down the street, looking at a woman and saying, "Good job, God." But that's as far as it goes, and you move right on. It doesn't stick in your head. It doesn't mess with you. It doesn't cause you to do anything else. You just see it. You recognize it. There it is. It is what it is. And you move on. Similarly, with same-sex attraction. It's entirely possible for someone to look, for a man to look at another man, for a woman to look at another woman and recognize the same thing as the opposite sex would. Good job. That is an attractive person. And leave it at that and walk on. You see, sin takes place when we give in to temptation. Sin takes place when we act against God's commands. Sin takes place when we reject or disregard God and live however we wish. For the Christian who has same-sex attraction but refuses to act on it because they know what God has said, they are not sinning because just because they have this attraction. And here I'll again direct you, for example, to Sam Allberry's book, Is God Anti-Gay? He knows that he will live a celibate life forever because he has no option. Even if the law in the United Kingdom were to change and were to say, yes, you can marry, he could never marry because God has said no. He knows that. He recognizes that. And what Sam Allberry is honest enough to say is, we live in a fallen world where sin has affected absolutely everything. Should we not be surprised if it has also affected the orientation that we have with respect to sexuality? And he has recognized this, and so he knows that this is part of the fall. He accepts this, but he does not accept the argument that that means I can just do what I want and I can go with it. No, God's word says, not an option. And so we have to distinguish between attraction and behavior or activity. Third, I hope these distinctions are helpful because they help us to focus on true identity. Human identity is bound up with deity. Human identity is bound up with God. We are who we are in relation to God, not in relation to our sexuality. Sexuality is not a defining characteristic. Who we are before a holy God in relationship to Him is what defines us. So for these and perhaps other reasons, I hope these distinctions are to some degree helpful, at least I have found them to be. Fourth, what the Bible says. What does the Bible say on this? So far, you may have noted I haven't said a lot about the Bible. I've given you some ways perhaps to think about this, ways to process this, ways to think about it in certain terms. But what does the Bible say? Because after all, as a pastor in the church, as a Christian, that's a great question to ask because the Bible is our standard for all that we do. As a Christian, this is all we can do. The church does not make up our policies, our doctrines. We don't just make this up and think, well, this is how we're going to think about this issue and this is how we're going to think about that by a vote. Or because we're traditionalists and we just want to go with a traditional argument. No. We do what we do. We believe what we believe because God has laid it out in his word. And the first thing I want to do is what sometimes is not done. You'll notice there 4a, the positive case for sexuality. We must remind ourselves, sexuality is a good and wonderful thing. God has given it to us at the beginning of creation. And so there is much that we can say that is positive about this before jumping into what that could be said as negative. So let me briefly note this, that God's creation is normative for human behavior. In other words, God did not create randomly. It just didn't happen to be a man, and it just didn't happen to be a woman. And this is affirmed in Genesis 2. After the Genesis 1 is the very first chapter of the Bible, and we have the creation account, and then Genesis 2, we have more detail and development and so forth. And in Genesis 2, God commands that the man shall leave his parents and be joined to his wife. He is commanding that this is how the family propagates, that you have a man and a woman, they have children. From those children, you have men and women who then marry and they have children, and on it goes. From the very beginning in creation, God has set up what he desires to be the way that humanity works. God in Genesis 1 and 2 is providing the paradigm for marriage and family life. And the fact that creation was intended to be normative and to exemplify the nature of marriage is again affirmed in Matthew 19. In Matthew 19, verses 3 through 6, the Pharisees, the religious elites of Jesus' day, came to him. And their question wasn't about homosexuality or same-sex attraction or anything like that. Their question was about divorce. They asked Jesus, well, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And it's only a few verses, so I'll read them to you so you get Jesus' own words. Jesus answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, in this, there are just a couple of things to note. First of all, Jesus says, God created them male and female. He goes all the way back to creation and says, that's the way God began things. In other words, here is Jesus' affirmation of the two necessary parts of marriage. Second, Jesus quotes from Genesis 2. A man will leave his family and be joined to his wife. In other words, the family unit of male and female parents is multiplied when men and women are joined together to form a new family. So far, everything is the same as what we see in Genesis. Jesus is simply affirming it here in Matthew. And then we see, third, that the male and the female become one flesh through sexual union. And then fourth, he ends with, let no one separate what God has put together. Marriage is a gift from God for one man and one woman that is intended to last for as long as they are both alive. Now, much could be said about bad marriages. Some of you may be thinking, well, that's all very well and good, but there are a lot of really bad heterosexual marriages. Yes, there are. But a bad heterosexual marriage does not negate the way God intended that we should live. The truth of how marriage should work and how it does work with one man and one woman is not negated because of sin. So indeed, Jesus affirms what we read at the very beginning of Scripture. I think there's one other text that's interesting in terms of this as well, and that is Ephesians 5. Towards the end of Ephesians 5, I won't read it, it's a bit longer, but towards the end of Ephesians 5, Paul addresses husbands and wives. And in this chapter, he makes it clear that the sexually immoral will be judged and will not dwell with God forever. And in this discussion, he turns to married couples and gives instructions to them as male and female. In other words, there is no other option for marriage in Paul's writings. But even more than this, Paul goes on to use marriage as the analogy for the church's union with Christ. And what is significant about this is that the analogy of union is one of bringing together that which is different, not bringing together that which is the same. In other words, as there is a man and a woman who are differentiated as they are brought together, so there is a God and his people, a creator and his creation, who will also be brought together. Marriage, in its differentiation of the two parties, is the example and image of Jesus and the church that are differentiated and yet are brought together into union. It is not same with same, it is unlike with unlike. So the focus and direction of the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexuality then is very positive with respect to male and female being in a marriage relationship. And yes, there are stories in the Bible of men and women who failed to live according to God's plan for marriage. And those stories are often included in the Bible as examples of the consequences of sin and refusing to live as we have been created to do. So the negative case for sexuality, in other words, what are the texts that talk about homosexuality? And I'm not going to go through them all. I list them there for you on the outline. And, we could go through them. I'm not going to just for the sake of time. But you see Genesis 19, Leviticus, there's 2 places, 18 and 20, Judges 19, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, and 1 Timothy 8. And what's interesting about these texts is that all of them uniformly have a negative view of homosexuality. In other words, there is nowhere in all of God's word that you can go that has a positive view of homosexuality. It doesn't exist, nowhere. Now, yes, there are plenty of theologians running around the place and philosophers and cultural critics and so forth running around the place who are saying, but you see, we can interpret these passages in different ways than the church has traditionally interpreted them. But even when they do that, what I find interesting is when they take those passages and they do things with them that I would never do, that's not legitimate, there are all kinds of examples, but when they do that, what they end up doing is not saying the Bible is therefore positive towards homosexuality. The most they can say is the Bible isn't addressing exactly this form of sexuality that we're talking about in our modern day. So all that they can really do is try and neutralize the Bible's negativity. Try to. In my view, they're utterly unsuccessful. But they tried because they have nowhere to go at all, anywhere in all of Scripture for anything positive to be said about homosexuality. Now, the one text I do want to draw your attention to is Romans 1. And again, it's a bit of a lengthy text. So I'll leave you to read it on your own. It's Romans 1, 18 through 32. And the sum total of it is this, and again, if you don't have it in front of you, you can listen to this. We'll be putting this on the website, the church website, and so you can listen to it again and compare this and when you have time to do so. But Romans 1, first thing that Paul says there is people suppress the truth. Those who are unbelievers, they suppress the truth and what can be known about God. In other words, there is a conscious rejection of God. Second, he goes on to say that people refuse to honor God and become futile and darkened in their thinking. And the result of that is, as he says, a number of what he calls exchanges. And he lists several exchanges. People exchange God for worshiping idols. They exchange proper relationships between a man and a woman with improper relationships, men with men and women with women, acting in a way that is unbecoming and unfitting. The reason I want to point out Romans 1 is, Paul is, I think, quite clear in Romans 1 in making it clear that the underlying sin that he's addressing, the bottom sin that he is addressing is not homosexuality. He is addressing homosexuality. But the bottom sin he's addressing is idolatry. The problem in Romans 1, as he makes quite clear, is people have stopped worshiping God and started worshiping something else. And there's a whole lot of something else's. So people have decided that they're going to worship created things. People have decided they're going to worship themselves. People have decided they're going to worship their own sexuality. People have decided they're going to worship something else. And the point that Paul is making is because they have exchanged proper worship of the true God for this false worship that has led to all sorts of degradation in other areas, specifically spiritual and moral. So that homosexuality is not the bottom sin, if you will, idolatry is. But out of idolatry come all kinds of sins, of which one is homosexuality, so homosexual practices. And the emphasis there in Romans 1 is very much on the practices. So please note again, we must distinguish here between what Paul is clearly describing as homosexual practice versus somebody who simply struggles with, I say simply, but struggles with same-sex attraction, but refuses to act on it. Romans 1 does not apply in its judgments to the one who may find members of the same sex attractive, but refuses to act on that attraction. They are not engaging in the practices described in Romans 1 because they know they're wrong. Why do they know they're wrong? Because they're worshiping the one true God. So the basic question of Romans 1 is, who do you worship? And that's the fundamental question. Who do you worship? If you do, and there's only two options. You may think there's a whole lot of it. There's really only basically two, and that's what Paul is giving us. Either you worship the one true God, or you don't. And the don't is, a huge category of all sorts of things. But it's either God or it's not. And Paul's point is, when we do not worship as we ought to, when we do not worship God, then we're in trouble. Finally, number 5, we bring this to a close. Does the Old Testament law still apply? Some of the arguments against the Christian view, for example, are to say that, well, you've got here in these texts, Genesis and Leviticus, especially Leviticus, Judges and so forth, those are Old Testament texts. And, that's the law. We're not under the law anymore, so the Old Testament doesn't apply anymore. Certainly not in the church, so Christians really shouldn't be saying anything about homosexuality based on the Old Testament, to be sure, because surely that's not the case. Well, the question of the relationship between the Christian and the law is one that has taken significant proportions of libraries to write about. I'm now exactly at 6:15. I don't have significant proportions of anything left. I want to bring this to a close so you have a chance to ask some questions. So my answer is clearly very modest for all sorts of reasons. First of all, I want to say this. Sometimes people have tried to answer this question with respect to dividing the law up into moral, civil, and ceremonial laws. And if you look at the Old Testament, the argument goes, you've got some moral laws, things you should do and not do, civil laws having to do with society and so forth, and then ceremonial laws, the Old Testament liturgy and practice and sacrificial system. Well, and then for that reason, then we can take some of the civil and certainly the ceremonial laws, and those don't apply anymore because Jesus has come, but the moral laws still do. I'm not a huge fan of this way of thinking about the law, mainly because, first of all, the Bible doesn't divide the law up in this way for us. We just decide, okay, let's do it ourselves. And if the Bible hasn't given it to us, it's a bit dicey as to whether or not we should be doing it ourselves. Furthermore, it's a little bit difficult to categorize. It's interesting that the laws don't easily categorize themselves in this way throughout, for example, Leviticus. It's not, here's the section on the moral law, here's a section civil, here's a section on ceremonial and so forth. There just doesn't seem to be that organized, or it doesn't seem to be organized in that way. So another approach is to deny the law altogether. The idea is that Christ has fulfilled the law, so Christians don't have to. The Old Testament law is obsolete. The only problem with this is Paul says in a number of places, for example, 1 Corinthians 7:19, he says that we are to keep the commandments of God. In the context, it looks awfully like that means the Old Testament. So what are we supposed to do? How do we go forward with this? Well, I'm only going to give you a suggestion as a way forward to begin thinking about this. It's not the end, it's the beginning. A third option, and the one that I think is helpful, is to understand the laws having two purposes. First of all, there are laws that are prophetic in nature. That is to say, they point to Christ. And he fulfills them so that we no longer have to. So, do we offer sacrifices anymore? No. Why? Because those laws pointed to Christ. He's fulfilled them, and that's it. They're finished. They're complete. They're done. So there are some laws that have a prophetic nature. They point towards Christ, and he has fulfilled them. There are other laws, a second group of laws, in terms of purpose, are laws that display wisdom. They may or may not point to Christ directly, but they are commands given by God that contain God's wise counsel. And for that reason, they still remain relevant. Because God's wisdom in the Old Testament has not been replaced and is new in the New Testament. His wisdom is sustained throughout both Testaments and all time. Clearly, in the 2 minutes that I took to say that, that's not all that could be said about the Christian and the law. But I hope that it begins to give you some kind of framework to think about the law, understanding that there is still wisdom contained in it. Wisdom for life, wisdom for obedience, and wisdom for how God has created us to live.